A 10-year-old girl vanished without a sound on a sunlit trail in the Grand Canyon, leaving behind only silence and fear. 5 years later, a drone captured something hidden in the depths that revealed a truth more haunting than anyone could imagine. The July sun was already high when the Miller family pulled into the parking lot near the south rim of the Grand Canyon, their silver SUV dusted with the miles it had carried them from Phoenix. John Miller stepped out first, stretching his tall frame as if shaking off the weight of long weeks spent behind a desk. His wife Rebecca followed, brushing crumbs from her skirt and shading her eyes against the brilliant glare that rose from the canyon's red stone walls. In the back seat, 10-year-old Grace tumbled out with a burst of energy, her blue backpack clutched against her chest, and her sneakers already dusty from rest stops along the way. Her hair was tied in 2 loose braids, and her eyes, wide and restless, darted from trail maps to the endless expanse beyond the railing. She had begged for this trip all summer, repeating stories she had read in a library book about the Bright Angel Trail and the wildlife that lived in the canyon's depths. John unlocked the rear hatch and began pulling out the camping gear. The man had the steady patience of someone who measured his life in schedules and careful lists, yet there was a tightness in his movements that Rebecca noticed. She had learned not to question him when he looked distracted, though she wondered why his eyes scanned the parking lot more often than the view. Rebecca took a deep breath of the hot, thin air, reminding herself that this trip was for Grace, their 1 week of escape from the ordinary world. She smiled at her daughter, who skipped in small circles, pointing out lizards sunning themselves on the rocks. "Can we see the river today?" Grace asked, tugging on John's sleeve. Her voice carried the unshaken confidence of a child who believed the world could not hide anything from her. John knelt, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Not today," he said softly. "The trails are long, and we'll start with something easier." He smiled, but the smile did not linger in his eyes. By late morning they had carried their packs toward the trailhead, their water bottles clinking with each step. Other families passed, some with wide-brimmed hats and walking sticks, others with cameras hung around their necks. Grace walked a few steps ahead, her laughter floating back toward her parents as she hopped from one flat rock to another. Rebecca watched her with both pride and unease, as though she feared the canyon might swallow sound as easily as it swallowed light. The vast silence of the place pressed on them, broken only by wind that whistled through stone arches. At one overlook, Grace pressed against the railing, staring into the abyss where shadows gathered like secrets. John pulled her back gently, his grip lingering longer than necessary. Rebecca laid a hand on his arm, trying to ease the tension, but he only nodded and shouldered his pack again. The family moved on, unaware of how precious these simple moments would become, and how quickly the canyon's beauty would turn into its darkest secret. The sun dipped lower as the Millers settled into their campsite near the edge of the canyon, its fading light washing the red stone cliffs in copper and gold. Grace bounded from the picnic table to the tent, helping her mother unroll sleeping bags and humming a tune she had picked up on the radio. Her excitement filled the clearing, but Rebecca felt something pressing beneath the surface of the evening. She caught John standing still beside the SUV, his eyes fixed on the narrow dirt road that wound past the campground. He held a water jug in his hands, though he had forgotten to move toward the cooking gear. Rebecca followed his gaze and noticed a dark vehicle parked just beyond the trees. The windows were tinted, and though the engine was quiet, it seemed too still, as if someone sat inside watching. When John realized she was looking, he forced a smile and carried the jug to the fire pit. "Probably another family," he said, though his tone carried no conviction. Rebecca wanted to believe him, but unease settled over her like the desert dusk. Grace remained oblivious, arranging smooth stones she had collected from the trail into a little circle. She announced proudly that it was a fairy ring, and she wanted to sleep inside it to dream of adventures. John ruffled her hair and told her to help gather twigs instead, his voice lighter but his eyes still glancing toward the trees. Twice he pulled his phone from his pocket, only to slip it back without making a call. Rebecca noticed, though she stayed silent. When the fire finally caught, its glow chased away the gathering dark. Other campers laughed nearby, their voices carrying on the wind, yet Rebecca felt as though the Millers sat apart, a pocket of unease in the middle of ordinary joy. Grace roasted a marshmallow until it blackened, squealing when it fell into the flames. John laughed, perhaps too loudly, as if determined to prove nothing was wrong. But later, when Grace curled against Rebecca's side, her sticky hands clinging to her mother's sweater, Rebecca saw John step away into the shadows. He lifted the phone to his ear, speaking in a low voice she could not catch. The sound of his footsteps returned minutes later, steady but heavy. He sank into the camp chair, staring at the flames as though they held answers. Rebecca touched his arm and asked if everything was all right. He nodded quickly, too quickly, and said it was only work, just unfinished business that would not leave him alone. She did not push further, though her heart tightened. Above them, the canyon sky stretched wide, filled with stars bright enough to seem within reach. Grace had already drifted into sleep, her breathing soft against the hum of night insects. Rebecca tucked a blanket around her daughter and whispered a silent promise of safety, though her own eyes kept turning toward the shadows at the road, where the dark vehicle still lingered, waiting without sound. The morning air carried a cool edge as the millers laced their boots and filled their bottles, the first light of day spilling across the cliffs. Grace skipped ahead on the gravel path that led toward the bright Angel Trail, her blue backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She sang a little tune as she went, her voice echoing faintly against the canyon walls. Rebecca called for her to slow down, but the child only laughed and darted around a bend where the path widened into a lookout. Other hikers paused there, some snapping photos, some pointing toward the river that glimmered far below. John adjusted the straps of his own pack, his brow damp, though the day had barely begun. He watched his daughter with a careful eye, his smile quick and thin when strangers greeted them along the way. Rebecca noticed his hand linger near his pocket where his phone rested, though no signal reached this part of the canyon. She wanted to ask again what weighed on him, but the brightness in Grace's eyes held her back. This day was for their daughter, who had begged for months to see the trail that she had read about in her school books. As they descended into the path, the air grew warmer, the sound of gravel crunching beneath boots mixing with the calls of distant birds. Grace rushed ahead to greet a group of tourists, chattering about the lizards she had seen near camp. One woman laughed and told her she was brave to have such energy so early in the morning. Grace beamed, proud of the attention, and bounded further along, her braids flying behind her. Rebecca hurried after, but when she glanced back, she caught sight of John scanning the ridge above them, his face tense, as though expecting to see someone watching. The trail narrowed in places, hugging cliffs where the drop stretched dizzying into shadows. Rebecca clutched the rail each time, but Grace danced across the stones, fearless in her small steps. At one switchback, Grace pointed to a rock shaped like a giant bird, her laughter ringing clear. She begged to take a picture, but John shook his head, urging her to keep moving. His voice carried an edge of impatience that made Rebecca look at him sharply, yet he would not meet her eyes. By midday, the sun bore down hard, heat rising from the canyon floor in wavering lines. Families passed them, heading back upward, faces red with exertion, while Grace seemed only to grow livelier. She skipped just ahead, then further, her voice rising in another song. Rebecca reached for John's hand, hoping to draw him into the moment, but his grip was stiff. When Grace rounded the next bend, her figure slipped from sight for a moment longer than it should have, and Rebecca's heart jolted. She hurried forward, calling her name, her voice catching on the hot wind, but only silence answered from the bend of the trail ahead. The canyon seemed to shift from wonder to terror in the space of a breath. One moment, Grace was only a few steps ahead, her laughter echoing against the walls, and the next the trail bent empty before them, the dust settling without her small feet stirring it. Rebecca called her name, the sound sharp and urgent, but there was no reply. She hurried forward, scanning the rocks, the railings, every patch of shadow where her daughter might be hiding. John rushed past her, his boots scraping on the gravel as he shouted into the silence. Other hikers turned, sensing the panic that hung suddenly in the air. At first it seemed possible that Grace had only slipped behind a rock or wandered around another bend. Rebecca clung to that thought, her eyes darting across the jagged path, willing her daughter to appear with that mischievous smile she often wore. But the minutes stretched, and with them grew the terror that something unthinkable had happened. John ran down the trail, stopping to peer over the edge where the drop plunged hundreds of feet. His voice cracked as he shouted Grace's name again, the echo mocking him as it carried into the depths. Within half an hour, rangers arrived, called by hikers who had hurried back to the trailhead to report the frantic parents. Radios crackled, whistles pierced the stillness, and the search widened along every branching path. Rebecca tried to answer their questions, her words tumbling out in broken pieces. She explained how Grace had been walking ahead, how she had only been out of sight for a moment, how there had been no sound of falling rock, no scream, nothing at all. The rangers exchanged grim looks but kept their voices steady, telling her that children wandered off often, that they would be found. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Dogs were brought in, noses pressed to the dirt where Grace's small footprints ended abruptly near a stretch of rail. The animals whined, circling, confused, before losing the trail entirely. Helicopters rose above the canyon, the thrum of their blades sending waves of dust into the air. But from the sky, the paths looked empty, only stone and shadow. Tourists gathered in hushed clusters, their eyes following every movement of the searchers, their voices low with dread. Rebecca clung to John's arm, though his body felt stiff, his eyes locked on the distant ridge as if he expected to see something there. She begged him to tell her what was wrong, but he only shook his head and whispered that he did not know. The fire of the sun burned down on them, yet Rebecca shivered as though a cold wind had swept through her bones. Hours passed, the shadows stretched long across the canyon floor, and still no sign of Grace appeared. What had begun as a day of adventure turned into a nightmare that neither parent could wake from, and as the light faded, the first hours of her vanishing closed in with silence deeper than the canyon itself. The command post was set up near the Bright Angel trailhead, a cluster of folding tables beneath a canopy, radios buzzing with clipped voices and maps spread wide across the surfaces. By the time Rebecca and John were guided there, the canyon had shifted into evening light, the air cooler but heavy with dread. Rebecca's hands shook as she clutched a paper cup of water, her eyes fixed on the map as though it could tell her where her daughter had gone. John stood rigid beside her, his arms crossed tight, answering questions with short words that carried no warmth. Ranger Daniel Hayes leaned over the map, a pen tapping against the grid lines. He pointed to the spot where Grace was last seen, a bend in the trail no more than half a mile from the overlook. "We'll focus teams here first," he said, his voice calm but urgent. Around them, volunteers gathered with flashlights and packs, their faces solemn. Some were tourists who had dropped everything to help, others were locals who knew the canyon's twists and ravines better than most. Rebecca tried to speak, her voice trembling. She explained that Grace had been walking ahead, that she had been laughing, that there had been no cry for help, no slip, no sound at all. Ranger Hayes listened, his brow furrowed, then asked about Grace's clothes, her backpack, even the color of her shoelaces. Rebecca answered each question, clinging to the details like they were lifelines. John added little, staring instead at the horizon where the canyon walls rose in shadow. Dogs were led out of their crates, handlers kneeling to let them sniff a shoe pulled from Grace's duffel. The animals barked once, straining at their leads, then padded off toward the trail. Rebecca followed with her eyes until the dogs disappeared into the darkening landscape. Helicopter blades thudded overhead, the searchlights sweeping across cliffs and ravines, but the canyon swallowed the light as though it belonged to another world. The radios crackled with updates. Nothing yet. No trace on the lower trail. Tracks too faint to follow. Rebecca pressed her hands to her face, whispering prayers into her palms. A ranger placed a blanket around her shoulders, though the air was still warm. John paced in tight circles, pulling his phone from his pocket and glancing at it, though he knew there was no signal. When Rebecca reached for him, he flinched, muttering that he needed air, though they were already outside. Night fell fully, stars spilling across the sky, but the command post stayed alive with noise, flashlights cutting beams into the black. Every few minutes someone returned with an update, and every time it was the same. No sign, no sound, nothing. Rebecca sat on a folding chair, her heart pounding with each passing hour, knowing her daughter was out there in the vast silence, while the canyon seemed determined to guard its secret. The longer Grace remained missing, the more the search turned into something colder, a shift from rescue to suspicion. By the second day, Rebecca noticed the way questions changed. At first, rangers had asked what Grace was wearing, what snacks she had carried, which trail she loved the most. Now, detectives pulled out notebooks and pens, their eyes sharper, their tone heavier. They wanted to know about John and Rebecca themselves, about their marriage, about money, about any fights that might have happened before the trip. Detective Carla Ruiz, steady and calm, sat across from them beneath the canvas of the command post. She asked Rebecca to recount every moment of the morning, every word spoken, every gesture Grace had made. Rebecca tried to hold the story together, but exhaustion blurred her thoughts. She repeated that Grace had been happy, that nothing seemed wrong, that she had only been out of sight for seconds. Ruiz nodded, writing, her face unreadable. When the same questions were turned to John, his answers came clipped, his jaw tight. He said Grace had walked ahead, that she liked to move fast, that they were planning to stop for lunch soon. He did not meet Rebecca's eyes while speaking, and Ruiz noticed. She asked if he had stepped away from the trail, if he had argued with Rebecca that morning, if Grace had been upset. John shook his head, his voice flat, insisting everything was normal. Still, Rebecca saw the detective watching him carefully, as though his silence spoke louder than words. Other officers searched their car, cataloging the contents. Camping gear, extra food, water jugs, a first aid kit. Everything seemed in order, but still, Rebecca felt judged, as though every item might hold a hidden meaning. She overheard murmurs between two rangers, wondering if Grace might have wandered off after a disagreement or if something darker had happened inside the family. The words pierced her like thorns. That evening, reporters appeared near the trailhead. Cameras aimed toward the command post. They shouted questions about the parents, their voices echoing across the parking lot. Rebecca turned her face away, clutching John's arm, but he pulled free, pacing in tight circles, his expression stormy. She heard one reporter whisper that the father looked nervous, that maybe the story was not what it seemed. Rebecca's chest tightened with rage and fear. She wanted to scream that they were wasting time, that every second spent questioning her family was a second lost in the canyon where Grace needed them. But her voice cracked when she tried to speak, and instead she sat silent beneath the harsh glow of the floodlights. As night fell, Ruiz approached once more. She told them they were not under suspicion, that this was standard procedure, that every missing child case required hard questions. But Rebecca could feel the shift. They were no longer only parents waiting for news. They were people under watch, their grief measured against suspicion, their pain folded into investigation. By the third day of the search, investigators began gathering the fragments of memory left behind by strangers who had crossed paths with the Millers. Rangers moved from campsite to campsite, asking anyone who had hiked Bright Angel Trail that Sunday what they had seen. Some remembered only the heat and the dust. Others recalled a little girl with 2 braids and a bright smile. Every account was written carefully in Detective Carla Ruiz's notebook, though the details rarely aligned. One couple said they had seen Grace at a rest stop around mid-morning, bouncing on the stone wall while her mother warned her to be careful. Another hiker claimed she had passed them closer to noon, skipping along the edge of the trail, her blue backpack swinging from side to side. Each description confirmed that Grace had been full of life, that nothing about her walk hinted at danger, but none could explain how she had disappeared in the space of a few steps. Then a man named Henry Olson came forward, a retired teacher from Colorado who had been traveling alone. He told Ruiz that he had noticed something odd near a bend in the trail around the time Grace was last seen. He said the girl had been speaking to a man in a red cap, someone who did not seem to belong to her family. The man had been crouched near the edge of the path, as if tying a bootlace, but Olson remembered how he kept glancing over his shoulder. Grace had laughed at something he said. Then Olson turned to adjust his pack, and when he looked again, she was gone. The man in the red cap had vanished as well. The statement sent ripples through the command post. Sketch artists were called, questions sharpened, descriptions written down with urgency. Olson insisted he had not imagined it, that the child had not appeared frightened, but that something about the man's posture had unsettled him. Rebecca clung to the detail as if it were proof that her daughter was alive, that she had been taken rather than lost. John, however, grew quiet, his jaw tight as he listened, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Other hikers were shown the sketch, but no one else recalled the man. Some swore they had seen no one matching the description, while others grew uncertain, their memories shifting under the weight of suggestion. Rangers searched the area again, combing through brush and ravines, but no red cap was found, no trace of anyone other than the Millers themselves. By nightfall, the theory of an unknown man had begun to unravel. Ruiz could not dismiss Olson's account, but without support it remained a lone thread in a tangled story. Still, Rebecca whispered Grace's name again and again, believing her daughter had been lured away by a stranger, believing that somewhere in the canyon she was waiting to be found. By the 4th morning, the searchers returned with what seemed at first like a breakthrough. A ranger hurried into the command post carrying a small hiking shoe wrapped in a clear evidence bag. The room stilled as every eye turned toward it. Rebecca felt her breath seize, her fingers tightening around the edge of the chair until her knuckles went white. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that this was Grace's, that her daughter's trail had finally been found. She rose to her feet before anyone spoke, her voice breaking as she asked if it belonged to her little girl. The shoe was set gently on the table and Rebecca leaned close, her eyes wide with hope and fear. It was scuffed, the laces caked with dust from the canyon, the size small enough to belong to a child her daughter's age. Rebecca whispered that it looked right, that Grace had a pair almost exactly the same, blue with a white sole, though she could not be sure in the dim light. John stood a step back, his arms folded tight, his face unreadable as if he already doubted what his wife wanted so badly to believe. Detective Ruiz called for a closer check, and the shoe was carried to the family's campsite where Grace's spare clothing had been kept. Side by side, the truth emerged quickly. The stitching was different, the shade of blue slightly off, the sole worn in a way that Rebecca admitted she did not recognize. The ranger who found it explained that it had been lying near a ravine 2 miles from the trail, weathered as though it had been there longer than a few days. Ruiz sighed, telling the parents it belonged to another child, another time, not to Grace. The air seemed to collapse around Rebecca. She sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. The small flame of hope that had burned so fiercely a moment before guttered into despair. John placed a hand on her shoulder, but his touch was stiff, his eyes already fixed on the maps again. Reporters outside had caught word of the discovery, and soon questions echoed across the lot, their voices eager for answers. When the correction came, when it was announced that the shoe was not Grace's, the disappointment was almost cruel. Rebecca wept openly, whispering that she had felt her daughter was close, that she had almost believed the nightmare was ending. Ruiz crouched beside her, speaking gently, reminding her that the search was still strong, that false leads were common in a place so vast. Yet the damage was done. The rush of hope, followed by the crash of truth, left Rebecca weaker than before, her faith shaken. She clutched Grace's stuffed rabbit against her chest, the one toy her daughter had left behind, and whispered that she would keep waiting, though each hour of silence felt like another mile between them. Detective Carla Ruiz had been trained to follow the obvious first, but as the days passed without trace of Grace, she turned her attention to what lay beneath the surface. The canyon offered no answers, the witnesses had grown unreliable, and the false leads had drained both the parents and the searchers. She shifted her focus to the Millers themselves, not with accusation but with the knowledge that vanishing often began long before the moment it appeared to. She asked quietly about John's work, at first expecting little more than the routine life of a suburban father, yet each detail pulled her deeper. He was not simply a project manager, as Rebecca had said. He worked for a private security firm that specialized in developing surveillance software. His recent projects had connected him with government contracts, companies that valued silence more than publicity. Ruiz made notes, her pen pressing harder than usual. When she spoke with John directly, his answers came smooth yet short, like stones skipped across water. He said his work was confidential, that he could not explain much, but Ruiz noticed the way his eyes shifted when she asked if he had received strange calls in the weeks before the trip. Rebecca had already mentioned them in passing, how the phone would buzz late at night, how John would step outside to answer, pacing in the yard until his voice grew low and sharp. John admitted there had been calls, only work-related, though his jaw tightened as he spoke. Bank records revealed another layer. In the month before the family traveled to Arizona, John had withdrawn large sums of cash, always in the same amount, just below the threshold that drew automatic attention. $6,000 gone in neat portions. When Ruiz asked him, he shrugged, claiming it was for home repairs, though no receipts followed. Rebecca sat pale beside him, confusion mixing with fear as though she was hearing these details for the first time. She confessed to Ruiz that John had seemed distracted all summer, more anxious than usual, checking doors twice at night, sometimes staring into the dark as though expecting movement. She had believed the trip was meant to bring them back together, that the canyon would remind him of peace. Ruiz drove back from the command post that evening with the weight of these findings heavy in her chest. The missing girl was still the heart of the case, yet the father's hidden layers unsettled her. Was he simply a man worn thin by pressure, or had his work entangled him in something darker? The canyon remained silent, but the life John had carried with him into it whispered with unease, as if secrets too heavy to keep had followed him onto the trail and left his daughter in their shadow. The trail of Grace Miller's disappearance seemed to narrow to one place, a stretch of bright angel where the path curved against a wall of stone and opened to a sudden drop into shadow. Searchers called it the vanishing point, the last spot where her footprints could be traced before they stopped as if she had lifted into air. The dust there was marked by her small sneakers, clear and sharp, then nothing. Dogs sniffed the ground, circling again and again, whining in confusion before pulling back with their noses lowered in defeat. Detective Ruiz stood at the edge, staring into the void below. It was a drop too steep for any child to survive, yet there were no broken branches, no sign of a fall, no fragments of fabric caught on the rocks. If she had slipped, the canyon would have left evidence. Instead, it seemed to have erased her. The technicians studied Grace's phone records, hoping for a thread. The last signal came at 4:15 in the afternoon, 2 miles down the trail, a weak ping bouncing from a distant tower. The location made no sense. Grace had not carried her phone that morning. Rebecca had packed it in her daughter's bag, which should have been on her shoulders. Yet the signal stopped abruptly, as though the device had been switched off or destroyed. Rebecca sat on a rock nearby, her hands trembling in her lap. She whispered that Grace had been right there, laughing, only seconds out of sight. Her voice cracked as she begged them to keep looking, to not let the canyon take her child without a fight. John stood further back, his gaze fixed not on the drop, but on the ridge above, his eyes moving as if following a memory only he could see. Ruiz noticed, her pen pausing in her notebook. Teams rappelled into the ravine, their ropes swinging against the cliff face. Hours passed as they searched every ledge, every crack, every patch of brush where a child might have landed. They returned with empty hands, their voices grim, saying there was no sign of human passage. From above, Rebecca sobbed openly, her cries carried down into the shadows. The Rangers marked the point on their maps, circling it with red ink. It became the center of every theory, the place where the ordinary laws of tracking seemed to break. Some whispered that she had been lifted over the edge by someone unseen. Others believed she had been carried away through the trees before the trail bent, her prints ending only because someone had erased them. As night fell, Ruiz stood once more at the vanishing point, the stars beginning to burn above her. She felt the canyon breathing around her, vast and indifferent, its silence heavier than words. Somewhere in that silence, Grace had been lost, and until the truth surfaced, this stretch of dirt and stone would remain the line where a child's life had been swallowed whole. The longer Grace remained missing, the more the canyon filled with voices that spoke not of rescue but of speculation. Reporters crowded near the command post, their cameras glowing at night, their microphones reaching for any statement from rangers or family. Television stations across the country aired nightly updates, and with each broadcast came new theories, each one darker than the last. Some claimed Grace had wandered into an unmarked cave. Others suggested she had been swept away by one of the sudden storms that sometimes struck the canyon floor. But the theories that took hold were never the gentle ones. One group of hikers insisted they had seen strange lights in the sky that evening, whispering about old legends of the canyon swallowing souls. Their words spread quickly online, and soon forums filled with arguments about whether Grace's vanishing was natural or something far more mysterious. Rebecca begged officials to stop such talk, but once the story entered the stream of rumor, it was impossible to pull it back. Detective Ruiz watched with frustration as leads became tangled with speculation. Volunteers arrived not to search but to take photos, chasing the thrill of being near a mystery. Each day, strangers cornered Rebecca, asking if she believed in spirits, in cults, in secret tunnels. She answered none of them, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. John withdrew further, his face blank each time he saw another headline. One article suggested that he had taken his daughter himself, vanishing her to cover some hidden crime. Another implied that Rebecca had been jealous of Grace's closeness to her father, that she had let her wander away. These suggestions cut deeper than silence, and soon both parents avoided reporters entirely, their movements shadowed by suspicion. Online forums grew wild with obsession. Armchair detectives mapped every inch of Bright Angel Trail, circling rocks and brush in grainy photos, claiming they saw figures hidden in shadows. Some swore the man in the red cap existed. Others called him a trick of memory, a lie planted for attention. Hours of debate produced nothing but noise, yet it consumed the search as much as the canyon itself. Ruiz knew such cases always drew obsession, but the speed of it unsettled her. What should have been a focused rescue became a spectacle, each theory louder than the last. Families who had once searched with hope began to drift away, muttering that the case was cursed, that no one would find the child because she had been taken by forces beyond them. Rebecca clung to the belief that Grace was alive, though every whispered rumor chipped at her strength. She stopped reading articles, stopped watching the news, but still, the voices reached her in the crowd. At night, she pressed Grace's stuffed rabbit to her chest, whispering that truth was louder than lies, even if no one else seemed to hear it. Yet in the shadows of the canyon, truth remained hidden, while theories and obsessions grew like weeds over a grave. The days following Grace's disappearance pressed down like stones, each one heavier than the last. What had begun as shared grief soon divided John and Rebecca into strangers sitting side by side. At first they clung to each other, whispering promises that they would not give up, that they would stay strong for their daughter. But sleepless nights and endless questions gnawed at those vows until they frayed into silence. Rebecca lived in the command post, clutching maps, begging rangers to search one more ridge, one more ravine, her voice trembling with the desperation of a mother who refused to surrender. She replayed every moment on the trail, every glance, every laugh, trying to find the instant she might have stopped Grace from slipping away. The guilt grew claws that sank into her chest, and she turned her pain into words that often cut John without meaning to. She accused him of being distracted, of watching shadows instead of watching their daughter, of hiding something behind the mask of calm he wore. John withdrew further each time, his jaw tightening, his words clipped. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, that no one could have stopped what had happened, that the canyon itself had stolen their child. Yet Rebecca saw the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, the way he stepped away to take calls that could not possibly connect in a place without signal. She began to doubt him in the same way detectives seemed to, her love straining under the weight of suspicion. The press circled like vultures, feeding on the cracks in their marriage. Headlines called them distant, divided, even suggested they were hiding truths from each other. Each report only deepened the space between them. Rebecca tried to ignore it, but she could not ignore the way John flinched when she reached for him, or how he stared at the ground instead of into her eyes. At night, in the small cot the Rangers provided, Rebecca lay awake with Grace's stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest. John slept on another cot across the tent, his back to her, his breathing steady but shallow. The silence between them became louder than any storm, filled with words neither dared to speak. She wanted to reach out, to beg him to tell her everything, to promise her that Grace was still alive, but fear sealed her lips, fear that he already knew more than he admitted. By the end of the first week, they no longer moved as a unit. Rebecca searched with volunteers. John kept to the edges, pacing alone. Their daughter's absence had not only stolen their joy, it had stolen the bond that had once seemed unbreakable. The canyon had taken Grace, and in its echo it began to take the family as well, piece by fragile piece, leaving two parents who no longer knew how to carry the same grief together. By the end of the second week, the search had thinned. The hum of helicopters no longer steady above the canyon, the lines of volunteers dwindling each morning. What began with urgency and voices calling Grace's name turned into silence broken only by the wind scraping across the stone. The command post remained, but its energy shifted. Maps, once crowded with markers, faded under dust, and the radios grew quiet. Rangers spoke in softer tones, no longer promising answers, only repeating that the canyon was vast and unforgiving. Detective Ruiz filed her reports with a heavy hand, noting the hours spent, the areas covered, the lack of evidence. Each word written felt like a stone placed on Grace's memory, building not a path to her but a wall of absence. She hated the term but knew it would be spoken soon. Cold case. A phrase that meant the canyon had swallowed a child and left nothing to follow. Rebecca refused to hear it. She remained near the trailhead each day, clutching her daughter's rabbit, waiting for movement from the trees, for some miracle return. Her face grew pale and thin, her voice hoarse from calling into emptiness. She begged new hikers to keep watch, to remember Grace's face, to report any sign of her on the trails. Most nodded with sympathy, but some only looked away, uncomfortable with the weight of her grief. John reacted differently. He grew quiet, almost ghost-like, spending long hours sitting alone in the parking lot, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When asked to speak with officials, he offered little more than short replies, as though the fire had drained out of him. Ruiz noticed, and though she still questioned his silence, she also saw the hollow in his eyes, the look of a man carrying more than he could admit. By autumn, the story had left national headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. Online forums still buzzed with speculation, but the world had largely moved on. Only the family remained bound to the canyon. Rebecca stayed in touch with the Rangers, pressing for updates even when there were none, while John returned to work, his days mechanical, his nights restless. Their marriage bent further under the weight of absence, each clinging to grief in separate ways. In official files, Grace's name was written in black letters under the category unresolved. The pages told nothing of her laughter, her running steps, her fearless eyes. They told only of dates, times, and missing evidence, as though a child could be reduced to the emptiness she left behind. Ruiz closed the file one evening, the word temporary stamped above the term cold case. She whispered to herself that nothing about the silence of the canyon felt temporary, that some absences were built to last, and that perhaps the hardest truth was that not every trail led to an answer. Some led only to shadows that never gave back what they had taken. 5 years had passed when the silence of the canyon was broken not by footsteps or voices but by the steady hum of a drone. Dr. Alan Chen, a wildlife researcher who had devoted his career to tracking eagle populations, guided the small machine over a stretch of gorge rarely touched by hikers. His focus was not on missing persons or mysteries, only on the nests hidden among cliffs where no human could safely climb. Yet, that morning, his screen revealed something that made his breath catch. The drone's camera captured the outline of a structure far below the rim, tucked into shadows where brush and stone concealed it from plain sight. At first, it seemed a trick of light, but as he circled the drone lower, the shape sharpened. There was symmetry in the pattern of branches, the angles too deliberate to be natural. More unsettling was the heat signature flickering on his monitor, faint but steady, as though something below was alive. Dr. Chen marked the coordinates and hovered, recording every angle. His hands trembled as he steadied the controls. He had flown over countless stretches of wilderness without finding more than deer trails or abandoned camps, but this was different. The branches were arranged with purpose, almost woven together, and beneath them, the glint of metal caught the light. He whispered to himself that it looked like a roof, A shelter pressed into the rock. For a long moment, he debated whether to report it. Researchers often stumbled on odd signs of human presence, and most amounted to nothing more than survivalists or lost campers. But he knew the canyon's history, knew of the child whose face had stared from posters for years, her braids and smile etched into memory. Something in the pit of his stomach told him the two were linked. By afternoon, he had driven to the nearest ranger station, his footage clutched tight in a portable drive. Officials gathered around the monitor as he played the recording, their faces grim and silent. The heat signatures moved faintly, too steady to be explained away by rock or shadow. The shelter was hidden in a place nearly impossible to reach without ropes and skill. Rangers exchanged quick glances, their voices low as they made the call to law enforcement. News spread through the department before nightfall. For years the case had grown cold, the file stacked beneath others marked unresolved. Now, in the glow of a researcher's drone, hope and dread sparked at once. If the shelter held answers, it might explain everything, yet the thought of what could lie within pressed like a weight on every heart. As stars spread across the desert sky, plans were drawn for a descent into the gorge. The canyon, silent for half a decade, now held a secret that could no longer remain hidden, a secret first glimpsed through the unblinking eye of a machine. The descent into the gorge began at dawn, ropes coiled and helmets strapped as a three-person team lowered themselves into the shadows where the drone had revealed its secret. The walls of the canyon pressed close, sheer and jagged, the drop too steep for any misstep. Deputy Michael Torres led the way, his boots scraping against stone as dust drifted into the air. The silence below was heavy, broken only by the clink of gear and the faint echo of their breathing. When they reached the bottom, the team paused to take in the sight before them. What from above had looked like tangled brush now revealed itself as a carefully constructed screen. Branches were lashed together and layered with stone, woven so skillfully that even trained eyes could have mistaken it for part of the cliff. Torres pushed the cover aside and uncovered a narrow opening leading into rock that had been shaped by both nature and human hands. He raised his light, and the beam cut across the darkness to reveal what lay hidden. Inside was a shelter that was no simple camp. Solar panels leaned against the rock, wires trailing into the cave where batteries glowed with stored energy. Water trickled into a crude filtration system built from pipes and barrels. Along one wall were rows of containers filled with dried goods, stacked neatly as if placed with care. It was not the work of a passing traveler. It was a home carved into secrecy. The deeper they stepped, the more details emerged. Blankets laid out in corners, books piled in uneven stacks, lanterns hooked onto metal braces. A faint smell lingered, a mix of smoke and damp stone. Torres knelt beside one corner where a low bed had been built from wood and cloth, a child's handwriting scrawled across a notebook lying open on top. He lifted it carefully and read the first page. August 16th, 2016, Day 2. Dad says we can't go back. The words froze him. The name on the cover was Grace Miller. Each line written inside spoke with the voice of a girl who had been missing for years, her thoughts trapped in ink while the world searched above. She wrote of her mother crying, of her father whispering that they had to stay hidden, of not understanding why she could not return home. Torres called up to the surface, his voice tight with urgency. "We've found something. You need to see this." The team documented every corner, photographing the shelves, the journals, the 3 distinct sleeping areas that spoke of a family living in isolation. It was not evidence of a crime alone, it was evidence of a life that had continued unseen. The canyon had not only hidden a child, it had hidden years. As Torres sealed the notebook in a protective bag, he looked once more around the shelter. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt lived in, heavy with the weight of secrets. The leather-bound notebook lay heavy in Detective Ruiz's hands, its edges worn smooth by years of touch. She opened it slowly, the pages fragile yet filled with the neat, careful handwriting of a child. The first entries were simple, almost innocent, describing the canyon walls, the sound of water dripping inside the shelter, the way her father had told her they could not go back. Grace wrote that her mother cried at night but tried to hide it, that her father promised someday she would understand. Each line carried the voice of a girl who still believed the world outside might call her home at any moment. As Ruiz turned the pages, the tone began to change. The words stretched with time, her sentences longer, her thoughts deeper. She marked birthdays in the margins, unsure if the dates were right, writing about how strange it felt to grow older without cake or candles, only quiet meals lit by lantern light. She described how her mother taught her math and reading, how her father showed her how to keep the solar panels working and how to purify water. Yet woven through the learning was loneliness. Grace confessed she dreamed of friends she no longer remembered well, of playgrounds and classrooms, of laughter that was not her own. The entries darkened further in later years. She wrote about the man who had frightened her father, the phone calls that never stopped, the way her parents whispered at night about people who wanted to hurt them. Grace said she asked once why they could not simply move to another town, and her mother told her the bad people would always find them. She tried to be brave, tried to see the shelter as adventure, but her words betrayed her longing. "I still believe Aunt Rebecca thinks of me," she wrote. "I hope she does not forget." One passage caught Ruiz's breath. June 4th, 2023. "I found Dad's old files. He said his work was meant to protect, but it was used to hunt. That is why we are here. That is why we cannot go home." The handwriting trembled on the page, as if Grace herself had shaken while writing it. The final entry was dated only months before the discovery. September 15th, 2023. "Dad says we have to leave again. He thinks the danger is still out there. I do not want to start over, but I will follow. I hope someone finds these pages. I want people to know we did not disappear because we wanted to. We disappeared because we had no choice." Ruiz closed the notebook with care, her chest tight. The journal was more than evidence. It was a voice pulled from the shadows, a child who had grown into a young woman while the world searched above. For the first time in years, Grace Miller spoke again, and her words told a truth no rumor ever had. The discovery of the shelter and Grace's journal forced investigators to look again at the shadows that had always hung around the case. For years, the idea of a stranger had been dismissed as rumor, a red cap remembered by one hiker and forgotten by all others. Now, with evidence of long-term hiding, the question grew sharper. Who had driven the family into the gorge, and who had kept them there? Fingerprints were lifted from the shelter, smudges across food containers, tools, and the rough doorway hidden by branches. Most belonged to the Millers, but several did not. When the results came back, the name attached to those prints startled even seasoned agents. They matched a man named Thomas Hale, a former maintenance worker employed at the park during the summer of Grace's disappearance. His record showed no violent crimes, only minor infractions, but his work had given him knowledge of trails tourists never saw, access to keys, maps, and storage areas tucked away from the public. Digging deeper, detectives found that Hale had resigned abruptly only weeks after Grace vanished. He had left his cabin at the edge of the park without warning, his rent unpaid, his belongings scattered. At the time, no one had linked his departure to the missing child, but now the fingerprints tied him directly to the hidden shelter. Neighbors recalled odd details when questioned again. They said Hale had been secretive, working late into the night, hauling supplies into the woods with no clear purpose. Some mentioned he had spoken about survival, about the need to live off the land when the world turned dangerous. His words had sounded eccentric but harmless, yet in hindsight, they carried darker weight. Investigators traced his movements after leaving the park. Records showed he had drifted through small towns in Arizona and Nevada, sometimes working construction, sometimes disappearing for months without a trace. His last confirmed sighting came in the spring of 2018, when he was treated at a rural clinic for a broken arm. After that, his trail ended. Theories formed quickly. Some believed Hale had discovered the Millers by chance, perhaps following John when he sought a quiet place to prepare his family's escape. Others argued he had been hired by the very people John feared, serving as a watchman to ensure the family never returned. The journals offered little clarity, only brief mentions of a man who frightened Grace's father, a man always nearby. A warrant was issued, and search teams scoured remote areas once tied to Hale. Though he remained missing, his presence in the shelter cast a long shadow. The canyon had not only hidden the Millers, it had hidden the hand of a man who seemed to vanish as completely as the child herself. For the first time, investigators faced the chilling truth that Grace's disappearance was not the work of accident or chance. It had been shaped by someone who knew the canyon's secrets and used them to bind a family in silence. The team returned to the gorge with stronger lights and breathing gear, determined to push deeper into the rock beyond the first shelter. The air grew colder as they moved forward, the walls narrowing into passages carved by water long before men set foot there. Each step echoed, heavy with the knowledge that this was not just wilderness, but a place someone had used for years. Torres led the way, his flashlight sweeping across damp stone until the beam caught on a second chamber. The space was larger, its walls blackened by smoke from fires that had burned low and hidden. Piles of refuse sat against the corners, empty cans, torn clothing, scraps of blankets. At first it seemed like nothing more than the remains of another crude camp, but then the light fell across something pale. Bones lay scattered, some small, some long, their edges gnawed by time. Silence swallowed the team as they realized the chamber held not only signs of survival but signs of death. They marked each piece carefully, photographs flashing in the darkness, every angle documented. A child's shoe sat near the bones, its leather stiff, its laces broken. Another corner held the remains of a backpack, faded fabric with patches that once bore cartoon characters. None matched Grace's belongings, but their presence told of others, people who had walked into the canyon and never walked out. The tunnels stretched on, branching into paths too dangerous to follow without more equipment. Yet even from the entrance of those passages came the smell of rot, faint but undeniable. Investigators whispered about Hale, about the stories neighbors had told of his strange late-night journeys into the park, about his obsession with hidden places. The shelter above had spoken of a family forced into hiding, but this chamber spoke of something darker, a place where others had been trapped and lost. Rebecca was not allowed near the site, but when officials described what they had found, she covered her ears, rocking in her chair, whispering that she did not want to hear. John sat rigid beside her, his face gray, his eyes fixed on the ground. Ruiz watched them both, her pen frozen above the page, knowing that while Grace's journal proved she had lived in hiding, these tunnels suggested the canyon had held many secrets, not all with survivors. The remains were carried out in sealed bags, each one a question without answer. Who were they? How had they come here? And why had no one searched deep enough to find them before? The canyon had kept its silence for years, and now it revealed only fragments, enough to haunt, but not enough to explain. As the team emerged into daylight, Torres whispered that the place felt cursed, that each shadow seemed ready to close again and hide what had been uncovered. For every secret revealed, the canyon seemed to guard 10 more, its tunnels stretching like veins of darkness beneath the stone. The journals, the shelter, and the tunnels had given the world answers, but for John and Rebecca Miller they opened wounds that could not heal. For 5 years they had lived with silence, each blaming themselves in ways they never spoke aloud. Now they sat in a small room at the ranger station, the notebook written in their daughter's hand resting between them. Rebecca traced the cover with her fingers, whispering Grace's name as though speaking it might call her back. The words inside told her that her daughter had grown up in darkness, writing about birthdays without candles, friends she could only imagine, and a father who carried secrets too heavy for a child to bear. Rebecca turned to John, her eyes raw with grief. She asked him what else he had hidden, what dangers he had known but never shared. John's voice cracked as he admitted pieces of the truth, how his work had placed him in the path of people who did not forgive betrayal, how he had believed taking his family into the canyon would protect them. He insisted he had never trusted Hale, that the man had appeared at first as a guide, then became a shadow too close to escape. But his words brought Rebecca no comfort. To her, every detail was another way he had failed to protect the daughter who had trusted him most. The weight of those lost years pressed down hard. Rebecca thought of the mornings Grace had written about her crying, the nights she had prayed that her aunt would remember her. Each sentence carved into her mind like a scar. She felt as though her daughter had lived a life apart, hidden in fear, while she had stood above the canyon begging strangers for help that never reached far enough. John sat with his face in his hands, the notebook still open before him. He whispered that he had only wanted to keep them safe, that he had chosen silence over risk, but that silence had stolen their child's childhood. He confessed that every step in the canyon had haunted him, that every shadow felt like the one that would take her. He admitted he did not know if Grace was alive now, or if leaving the journal was her way of saying goodbye forever. Detective Ruiz entered briefly, telling them the investigation would continue, that Hale's trail would be followed, that Grace's words gave them more than they had ever had. But the parents hardly heard. They were trapped in the weight of the reckoning, forced to face what their choices had cost. That night, as they left the station, Rebecca carried the notebook pressed against her chest. She whispered that she would never stop searching, that if her daughter had left her words to be found, then somewhere Grace still hoped for return. John walked beside her in silence, his shoulders bowed beneath the truth that no canyon could hide. The discovery of the shelter and the words Grace had left behind rippled far beyond the canyon. For years, her face had been another on a poster, another plea on a news broadcast, but now her story carried weight no rumor could distort. Reporters returned in waves, their cameras aimed at the gorge where the Millers had vanished. Yet the attention was different this time, less sensational, more reverent. People wanted to understand what it meant for a child to grow up in silence, her childhood traded for survival, her voice confined to a journal that spoke louder than any headline. Rebecca found herself standing before microphones, her hands trembling as she held Grace's notebook. She did not read from it, but she told the world her daughter was more than a mystery. She spoke of her laughter on the trail, her love for stories, her fearless way of running ahead with her braids swinging. Her voice cracked when she admitted she did not know if Grace was alive now, but she wanted the world to carry her daughter's name with respect, not whispers. The canyon itself changed. Rangers posted new warnings, maps redrawn to account for hidden paths and abandoned tunnels. For decades, Bright Angel had been a trail of beauty, but now it was also marked with memory. Tourists paused longer at the overlooks, not only for the view but for the story carried in the wind. The story of the girl who had vanished, yet found a way to speak through pages no one expected to find. Detective Ruiz retired soon after, but she kept a copy of one entry on her desk. In it, Grace had written, "I hope someone remembers us. I hope being forgotten is not worse than being found." Ruiz often said those words reshaped the way she thought of every missing case. That they reminded her not every silence meant death. Sometimes it meant waiting. Sometimes it meant survival in ways no one could imagine. Online, communities formed around Grace's name. People wrote letters to her, strangers who said her strength gave them courage to face their own fears. Teachers used her journal in classrooms, showing children how even in the darkest places a voice could endure. For many, Grace became more than a missing child. She became a symbol of survival against odds no child should have carried. For John and Rebecca, the legacy was heavier. They lived with both pride and grief, knowing their daughter's words had touched thousands, yet aching that those words came from years she should have lived in freedom. At night, Rebecca still whispered Grace's name, holding to the belief that somewhere her daughter might hear. The canyon remained vast and indifferent, its walls silent, but in the hearts of those who learned her story, Grace lived on. She had been a girl lost to shadow, yet through her words she became a voice that could never again be erased.